Confucius, Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. How did the Middle Kingdom become a global superpower? China's history is filled to the brink with fascinating events and personalities. For example, did you know there was a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ himself and tried to establish a Christian kingdom of peace? His rebellion ended up causing up to 30 million deaths. But let's start from the beginning. Good day, kings! Today we are launching our brand new documentary series where we explore interesting topics in 10-minute short documentaries. From history and economics to current geopolitical issues, we'll cover a wide range of subjects. If you have any suggestions for future topics, drop them in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to become an actual king. Trust me, it works. To make things a bit easier to follow, we've split the video into 4 parts. First, the origins of China from around 2100 BC to 1271 AD. Second, the invasions of the nomadic tribes from 1271 to 1839. Third, the Century of Humiliation from 1839 to 1937. And fourth, the Communist Revolution to China's rise as a global superpower from 1937 to the present day. The origins of the Middle Kingdom. China's long history of dynasties began around 2100 before Christ with the Xia dynasty, which ruled until about 1600 BC. Since then, the region we now know as China has had more or less continuous existence as an empire that can be called China, with 4000 years of uninterrupted history, making it the world's oldest civilization that still exists today. To be quite honest, this early period is probably a bit boring. Dynasties came and went, and there were some periods where China was divided between 2 or 3 dynasties, but these periods were always followed by a strong dynasty reunifying China. Still, a few key events and figures stand out. During the Zhao dynasty, which ruled for nearly 800 years from 1046 until 256 BC, the mandate of heaven was introduced. This idea stated that the ruler was given divine authority to rule all under heaven, making him the son of heaven. It's similar to the European idea of the divine right of kings, but in ancient China, things could also go the other way. Natural disasters like floods and famines were seen as signs from heaven that the ruler had lost his mandate, thus often leading to rebellions. If one emperor replaced another, it also meant the previous one had lost the mandate of heaven. So Chinese emperors couldn't do whatever they wanted, but had to pay attention to the well-being of their people. This concept of the mandate of heaven lasted all the way up until the last emperor, who was only deposed in 1912. The Zhao dynasty also gave us 2 iconic figures. Confucius, who lived from 551 until 479 BC, and Sun Tzu, who wrote the world-famous book The Art of War in the 5th century BC. These 2 significant figures continue to influence Chinese culture and morality to this day. Even though the Qin dynasty only ruled for 15 years starting in 221 BC, it's the dynasty which the name China stems from. The name probably traveled all the way through India to Europe. By the way, thanks to vast trading networks, even ancient Romans knew of a gigantic empire in the Far East. Anyway, however, the Chinese themselves call their country Zhongguo, which means Middle Kingdom, or translated more literally, Central Country. The name China is mainly used abroad. The invasions of the nomadic tribes. In 1271, the Mongols under Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, defeated the Sung dynasty and founded the Yuan dynasty. This was the first time all of China was ruled by a non-Chinese dynasty. China was now part of the largest empire the world has ever seen. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific all the way to Poland. Albeit being brutal conquerors, the Yuan dynasty encouraged trade along the Silk Road and cultural exchange between East and West, which resulted in China becoming more well known in Europe. After just under a century, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown in 1368 by Zhou Yuanzhang, who founded the Ming dynasty, which lasted almost 300 years. This period is seen as a golden age of economic and cultural prosperity, which is why the Ming dynasty is seen as one of the biggest and most famous dynasties in Chinese history. You've probably heard of Ming vases, right? During this time, China was arguably the most powerful empire in the world, which we want to explain using an interesting example. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. His expedition consisted of 3 ships with a crew of 90 men, with the largest ship being 25 meters long. Well, sounds quite impressive, right? Just a few decades earlier, China's Admiral Zheng He led several major expeditions between 1405 and 1433. Each of these expeditions consisted of between 200 and 320 ships and a crew of as many as 30,000 men, with the largest ship being 120 meters long. Yep, you heard that right. China always operated on a completely different scale from the West. These expeditions reached as far as Indonesia, India and even East Africa. But unlike the colonizing Europeans trying to make a fat profit off of their colonial ventures, the Chinese were more interested in showing off the emperor's power and gathering tributes to show off. Some examples are giraffes, ivory and spices. Of course, these expeditions were not really cheap, quite the contrary. Due to this, after Admiral Zheng He's death, other voices gained the upper hand in the Middle Kingdom and China withdrew completely from maritime exploration, letting its fleet decay. This is a repeating pattern throughout Chinese history. 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. Imagine how different world history would look like if China had landed in Europe with 30,000 men in the 1400s. This continuous back and forth is a recurring theme in China's history. At first, one emperor pushes for progress, then the next emperor focuses on tradition and undoes all of this progress. Even in gunpowder and metallurgy, China was far ahead of the West, but the Middle Kingdom never managed to create any lasting gains out of this progress. In 1644, the Ming dynasty was finally overthrown by the Manchu from today's Manchuria, who then founded the Qing dynasty, China's last dynasty. After almost 200 years of prosperity and peace, the Middle Kingdom entered a period of weakness and instability just as the West came knocking for the first time. To give you a short visualization of China's strength just before its first hostile contact with the West, in 1820, Qing China generated approximately 30% of worldwide GDP, so China alone had basically a third of the world's production. In 2022, it was approximately 19%. The Century of Humiliation. In 1839, the First Opium War broke out between Great Britain and China. To make a long story short, China's goods, especially tea, silk and porcelain, were in great demand in the West and quite expensive, while Britain had little to offer in return. So, how to pay for these popular Chinese goods? The British solution? By flooding China with opium from its Asian colonies and selling it in China. As more and more Chinese became addicted to opium, this led to serious social and economic problems. Due to this, the Chinese official Lin Zexu decided to ban the opium trade and destroyed large amounts of British opium. Unsurprisingly, the bosses of the British opium cartel liked this not one bit. Thus, they personally went to the British government in London to complain, and since the opium trade was so damn profitable to Great Britain, managed to have the government start a war against Qing China. Britain was practically a narco-state at that point. Pablo Escobar could only dream of having this much power. By 1842, after just 3 years of war, China was humiliated to the bones and forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. Hong Kong was ceded to Great Britain, 5 more ports were open to British trade, including Shanghai. China had to pay hefty reparations for the destroyed opium, and Great Britain was to get every trade discount on Chinese goods that any other nation got. But of course, that wasn't yet enough. Between 1856 and 1860, Britain and France fought a second opium war. The result was that opium was officially legalized, more ports were to be given to the Europeans, Christian missionaries were allowed free passage through all of China, and of course, China had to pay even more massive reparations. This was the most humiliating time in China's history, and even today Xi Jinping talks about it in a sad tone. To understand how weak China had become, we want to mention the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864. This uprising was led by Hung Xiuquan. After failing at the civil service exam several times, he suddenly had a vision in which it was revealed to him that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ himself. With the goal to establish a strict Christian heavenly kingdom of great peace, he rebelled against the Qing dynasty. Overall, the conflict lasted 14 years and caused between 20 and 30 million deaths, half as many as the entire World War II. In 1912, the last emperor, Puyi, remember this guy for later, was deposed, although he continued to live like an emperor in the Forbidden City in Beijing until 1924, shielded from the outside world. Anyway, at that moment in 1912, the Republic of China was founded. Do name and flag sound familiar to you? You'll find out later why that is. In any case, the Republic of China never managed to become a stable state that could fully exert control over its territories. There was extreme corruption and, in fact, the majority of the country was controlled by warlords, out of which some were more and some were less loyal to the Republic. These were ideal conditions for an expansionist neighbor to exploit for its own gains. Thus, in 1895, Japan conquered the Chinese vessel Korea, and in 1931, after an obvious false flag operation, a small explosion on Japanese railway tracks, they attacked again and seized Manchuria. Here, the Japanese installed Puyi, you remember the guy, as a puppet emperor. By the way, there's a cool film about his life called The Last Emperor. Anyway, this was, of course, not the end of China's imperial ambitions. The rise of the People's Republic. In 1937, Japan launched another war against China after the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge, at which a Japanese soldier got lost for a few hours and then resurfaced, which anyway led to skirmishes between Japanese and Chinese troops as a pretext, and this time decided that the war should be conclusive. Despite all of China's warlords uniting and receiving weapons, military advisory and financial support from the West and the Soviet Union, Japan managed to conquer large parts of China using brutal methods. The front lines eventually stabilized, and after Japan's surrender in 1945, Japanese forces left China for good, but the fighting wasn't over yet. Already in the 1930s, a civil war had begun between the Communist Party and the Republic of China. After the Communists had founded the so-called Jiangxi Soviet Republic in southern China, they were decisively defeated by the Republic of China's far more powerful army. Instead of giving up, the Communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, retreated over 9,000 kilometers or 5,600 miles into the northern Chinese mountains to regroup and gather strength, all the while being constantly attacked by Republican troops. Of the 86,000 communists who set off in October 1934, only about 8,000 arrived a year later. The Long March is now considered one of the most important moments in Chinese history and signals the steadfastness and perseverance of the Chinese communists. Many of today's Chinese leaders are children of communists who marched with Mao in the Long March, including Xi Jinping. After the Chinese Civil War was paused during World War II to fight against Japan, it flared up again immediately after Japan's surrender. Since the Republic of China was extremely corrupt and war-torn, the communists were able to garner more and more support, especially amongst rural farmer populations, and finally drove the government of the Republic of China out of mainland China in 1949. While Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, the old government under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, where the Republic of China still exists to this day. This also explains the current importance of Taiwan to China. As long as Taiwan remains independent, the conquest of China is not yet complete. Until Mao's death in 1976, China couldn't really improve its position as a poor, agriculturally dominated country. Instead, the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962 and the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 led to an even stronger focus on communist principles and to famines with absurdly high death tolls. Incidentally, during the Cultural Revolution, Xi Jinping was also sent to the countryside at the age of 15 for about 7 years to work as a farmer, a time that greatly influenced him and has become an important part of his political story. We also want to briefly talk about the last emperor, Puyi. After Japan's defeat, he was held in a re-education camp from 1945 to 1950 to teach him communist ideology. Remarkably, he was released and lived a modest life as a gardener until his death in 1967. From Emperor of China to a simple gardener, what a life. It was only Deng Xiaoping, from his rise to power in 1978 until his death in 1997, who managed to open the country through economic reforms, planting the seeds for the great power that we know today. For the first time, China was open to foreign investment and economic special zones were created, through which the country could become a global production powerhouse. Of course, Deng also marched with Mao on the Long March, but he was ostracized during the Cultural Revolution because of his market-oriented views. It wasn't until after Mao's death that he was able to begin reshaping China according to his vision. Today, Deng Xiaoping is considered the architect of modern China. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 finally marked the rise of the Middle Kingdom as the factory of the world. The enormous amounts of money China was able to generate as an export nation through a positive trade balance were invested in the construction of modern infrastructure. As a result, Chinese cities were able to grow to massive sizes at an unprecedented pace. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, no one could have foreseen that he would become China's most powerful man since Mao. In fact, Xi was initially elected General Secretary as a compromise candidate because the rival factions could not agree on any of their candidates. Almost immediately, Xi was able to eliminate rivals through an anti-corruption campaign and place his own men in key positions to build an increasingly strong power base. In 2018, Xi was finally able to remove the two-term limit from the constitution and simultaneously had the Xi Jinping thought enshrined in the constitution as an ideology. Ever since then, it's abundantly clear to everyone, Xi Jinping pulls all the strings in today's China and will remain in power until he either dies or steps down voluntarily. In every sense, China is a colossus today. China is the world's manufacturing superpower and is increasingly becoming a global leader in future industries like AI, e-mobility and renewable energy. In terms of GDP, China ranks second in the world behind the USA. In terms of GDP by purchasing power parity, it even ranks first. With over 2 million active soldiers, China has the largest army in the world and its military spending is second only to the USA, although China is constantly increasing its spending at a steady pace. Today, it's clear to everyone. In every respect, China is a global superpower. The future will show whether China can continue its rapid growth trajectory despite various crises and problems. At the beginning of 2024, amid a real estate crisis, one of the largest property developers, Evergrande, went bankrupt, youth unemployment is high, and China also faces demographic challenges. Nevertheless, China has continued to grow rapidly in recent years, though not as quickly as it did 10 or 20 years ago. What do you think? Where is the development headed? Just as a reminder, today China generates 19% of global GDP, while in 1820 it was a whole 30%. In recent decades, China has undergone a development unique in world history, living over 1 billion people out of poverty, a true economic miracle. After years of humiliation, China has now regained its place as a global superpower. But as history has shown, the rise of a new superpower can often lead to conflict. Let us know in the comments who you think the 21st century will belong to, the USA, China, or perhaps another up-and-coming power. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to our channel to become an actual king. Trust me, it works. Since the series is brand new, we would also appreciate any feedback as well as suggestions for future topics. From the history of a country to economic issues to current geopolitical topics, anything can be included.